Do you happen to grow up in a household where domestic violence is enormous? How did you turn out? Me, please. Daddy, please stop fighting, David cried, standing between his parents. His small face was wet with tears, and his voice shook as he begged them. His father, Michael, stood by the table, pointing his finger at Sarah, his wife. You don't listen to me. You think I'm not good enough, he shouted angrily. And you don't care about this family, his wife yelled back. All you do is blame me for everything. David held his little sister, Grace, tightly on his back. She was only 2 years old and was crying loudly. David's heart hurt as he tried to keep her calm. Please stop shouting. Grace is scared. I am scared, he cried again. But his parent didn't listen. Michael banged his hand on the table, and Sarah picked up a pillow and threw it across the room. David stood frozen, holding Grace, his sister, tears running down their cheeks. After what felt like harass, Michael grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Sarah sat on the couch and buried her face in her hands, crying softly. The clock on the wall showed it's past 11:00 p.m. The house was quiet now, but David's heart was still racing. He wiped Grace's face and carried out to their small mattress in the corner of the room. He laid her down, gently covering her with a thin blanket. It's okay, Grace, he whispered. Go to sleep now. Grace closed her eyes, and once she is asleep, David sat by the wall. His small hand covered his face as he began to cry. He poured out his heart. Dear God, he whispered through his tears, please help my mommy and daddy. Make them stop fighting. I just want us to be happy as a family. David sat there in the quiet room, his tiny heart heavy with sadness. The noise of cars outside the window was the only sound left in the night. The next morning, the morning sunlight streamed through the window as the city outside hazy with lives inside their apartment. However, the tension from the previous night lingered like a heavy fog. David woke up early, quietly helping Grace brush her teeth and dress her up while his parents prepared for the day in silence. Michael stood by the kitchen table, sleeping his cup of tea, while Sarah folded clothes in the corner. Neither of them said a word to each other. David glanced at them, his little heart pounding. He couldn't hold it in anymore. He had to speak. Mommy, Daddy, David said softly, breaking the silence. Both parents looked up at him. I need to talk to you, please. Can we all sit down? The little boy said. Michael frowned, but walk over to the table. Sitting down with a sign. Sarah hesitated before sitting across from him. David stood between them, holding Grace's hand tightly. His eyes were red and puffy, but his voice was steady. Mom, Dad, he began, looking at both of them. Last night you were fighting again, like you always do. Grace was crying so much because she was scared. I was scared too. I don't know why you keep fighting, but it hurting. Sarah's face softened for a moment, but before she could speak, Michael interrupted. David, we are not fighting because of you. This is hard stuff. You are too young to understand. But I do understand, David said, his voice rising slightly. I see everything. Every time you fight, the house feels like it's breaking her heart. I can't sleep. Grace can't sleep. I am always scared that one day, his voice cracked, that one day you might hurt each other. Please, can't you just stop fighting? Can't you just talk nicely to each other? Sarah cross-eyed. David, you don't know how hard it is to live with your father, to live with someone who doesn't respect you. Respect, Michael. See, you are the one who start all the fights. Sarah, I come home from work and all you do is complain about what I didn't do. That's because you don't do anything. Michael, I'm the one who keeps this house running. David shook his head, tears welling up again. This is exactly what I mean, he shouted, a small voice trembling. You are doing it again, blaming each other instead of listening. Why can't you just stop for once and think about me and Grace? Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You see what I'm talking about, Sarah? Even the boy is blaming me now because of the things you say. I didn't tell him to say anything. He just repeating what he sees. Sarah snapped, a voice rising. David stepped back, holding Grace tightly as their parents began arguing again. This is your fault, Michael. You are the reason this house is falling apart. No, Sarah, it's you, always making yourself the victim. David's chest felt heavy as the shouting grew louder. He had tried to help, but now it was even worse. Without saying a word, he picked up his school bag, gently kissed Grace on the forehead, and walked out of the apartment. The voices of his parents followed him down the hallway, But he didn't look back. You must be wondering if they didn't have any elderly person in their family who could intervene. Right, of course. They have tried their best, and now they left them to their fate. David sat quietly at his desk, staring at the chalkboard as his teacher, Mrs. Daniels, explained a math problem. Normally, David was the most eager student in the class, always raising his hand at the right answers. But today he felt distant, his mind stuck on the morning's event. "David, are you okay?" his friend Ben whispered from the desk behind him. David gave a small nod, but didn't say anything. He kept his eyes down, pretending to read his notebook. Mrs. Dennis noticed his unusual behavior and walked over to him after the lesson. "David," she said, gently crouching beside his desk, "you are very quiet today. Is everything all right?" David looked up at her kind face, forcing a small smile. "I am okay, ma'am," he said softly. Mrs. Daniel didn't press further, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment before she returned to the front of the class. When it was time for the weekly lesson test, David took a deep breath and focused on his paper numbers, and word filled the page. And for a while he was able to push aside his worries. By the time he handed his paper, he felt a small sense of relief. At the end of the day, Mrs. Daniel stood in front of the class holding the stack of graded tests. "Great work today, everyone," she said. But as always, one student stood out. She smiled warmly. "David, congratulations, you got the highest score again." The class clapped, and Ben pat him on the back. "See, you are still the best, even when you're quiet," he said with a grin. David managed a small smile, but his heart felt heavy. He was proud of his achievement, but he couldn't shake the sadness from home. As he pared his back to leave, he whispered to himself, "I just wish Mama and Papa could be proud of me too." Walking home, David felt the weight of the day pressing on him. The noises of cars and people in the busy city filled his ears, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't want to go back to the apartment, where his parents would probably still be arguing. For now, school was his escape, the only place where he could find a bit of peace. But deep down, he longed for peace at home too. As he was walking home, he decided to change his destination. He headed towards his Aunt Le's home. It was a small apartment on the other side of the town, far from the shouting and chaos he had left behind at home. He didn't know what to do anymore, but he knew he needed to talk to someone who cared. Aunt Linda opened the door, a warm smile fading when she saw the worry edge on David's face. "David, what are you doing here? And where is Grace, your sister?" "She with Mama," David replied softly, stepping inside Aunt Linda. "I need to talk to you, Ma." Linda closed the door and led him to the couch. "Of course." "David, what's wrong?" she asked, a voice gentle. David sat down and stared at the floor for a moment. His small hands clapped tightly against each other. Then, in a shaking voice, he said, "Mommy and Daddy are always fighting every day. They yell and scream at each other. Sometimes they throw things. It's scary. And Linda, I tried to stop them, but they won't listen to me." Linda's heart broke as she watched tears spill from David's eyes. "Oh, David," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I am so sorry you're going through this. It's not just me, Hooney." David continued, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Grace cries all the time. She doesn't understand what's happening, but she's scared too. I pray every night for them to stop, but it never changes. I don't know what to do anymore." Hooney. Linda pulled back to look at him in the eyes. "David, I am so proud of you for speaking up. You are so brave. I promise I will do something about this. Your mom and dad love you and Grace, but they need to understand how much their fighting is hurting you." David nodded, his heart feeling a little lighter. "Thank you, Auntie," he said, wiping his tears after a warm meal and some time to relax. David returned home. The apartment was quiet when he arrived. His parents weren't speaking to each other, but at least there was no shouting. He carried Grace to bed, hoping that tomorrow will be different. The next morning, Aunt Linda decided to pay Esther a visit. She arrived at Sarah's house, knocking firmly on the door. When Sarah opened it, Ace registered surprise. "Linda, what brings you here? We need to talk," Linda said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Sarah sighed and crossed a "Hey, if it's about Michael." "Yes, it's about Michael," Linda interrupted. "And about you and those kids. Sarah, your marriage is toxic. David came to me yesterday crying because he can't take it anymore. Do you know how hard it must have been for him to come to me? It's just a child." Sarah's expression flattered for a moment before she said defensively, "I know things aren't perfect, But what do you want me to do, Linda? Leave my marriage. I have invested too much in this. I can't start over, and I won't have my kids. Growing up with different fathers, Linda shook her head. I voice friend. But come, Sarah, you are staying in this marriage for the children. But have you thought about what kind of life you're giving them? David told me he's scared every single day. Grace is crying all the time. The environment you keeping them is not healthy, Sarah. They are suffering. And you don't even see it. Sarah's lip trembled as she turned away. I am doing the best I can, she muttered. Are you, Linda? Gently. Because what I see is a woman holding on to a marriage that is already broken. And in the process, you're breaking your children too. Sarah sank onto the couch, her face in her hands. I don't know what to do, she whispered. Start focusing on your children. Linda said, sitting beside her. If you're not happy in this marriage, leave. Your kid needs a healthy, loving environment. That's more important than staying together for the sake of appearances. Nodded slowly. You are right, she said. I will try to be a better mother, I promise. But promises were easier said than kept. Do you think things would change after this? Of course. For a few days, there was peace in the house. Michael and Sarah spoke civil to each age, and the fight seemed to stop. David allowed himself to hope that things were finally changing, but it didn't last. One evening, Michael came home late from work, and Sarah, suspicious, fled. Where were you? She demanded the moment he walked in. At work, Michael replied, his stone-tired liar. Sarah shouted, you are with another woman wearing to. Don't think I don't know what you up to. My M's patient snapped. You are always accusing me of something I haven't done. Maybe if you weren't so controlling, I wouldn't feel like staying at work longer. The argument escalated quickly, and this time it turned physical. Sarah threw a cup which shattered against the wall. Michael grabbed a hand, pushing her away as she screamed at him. David, holding Grace in his arm, stood frozen in the doorway, watching the chaos unfold. Tears streamed down his face as he shouted, stop it, please stop. But they didn't hear him. The sound of shout and crashing object filled the air. Unable to take it anymore, David ran out of the apartment, with Grace sobbing as he knocked on their neighbor door. Please help us, he begged, his voice trembling. Mommy and Daddy are fighting again. The neighbors hurry to intervene, but as David stood in the hallway, clutching his little sister, he realized something painful. No matter how much he prayed or tried to fix things, his home was a place of endless chaos. David sat quietly on the staircase outside their home, staring at the sky. As the sun began to set, the weight of his world bore down on his small shoulder. His parents' fighting had grew worse, and no amount of begging, praying, or running to Aunt Linda seemed to help. The chaos of his home was like a that never ended, and he had long stopped believing it would. Inside, the shouting resumed. Sarah's voice cut through the thin walls. You think you can just come and go as you please, Michael. You are never here. And when you have, you make life miserable for all of us. Michael's response was Venus. If this house is so miserable, Sarah, maybe you should leave. You have been nothing but a knack since the day we got married. David covered his hair, trying to block out the noise. Grace, now 3 years old, was in their shed room, crying softly into a pillow. He couldn't protect her anymore. He couldn't even protect himself. That evening, after the shouting finally stopped, David talked Grace into bed and stared at her tear-struck face. Don't worry, he whispered, stroking her head. One day we will be free from all of this. Grace didn't respond. She only curled closer to her pillow, clang a tiny door, the only comfort she had in the world. The next day started like high-hull tension, thick in the air. No one speaking at breakfast, everyone avoiding eye contact. But by evening, the storm returned with greater force. Sarah had found a receipt of a dinner at an expensive restaurant in M's pocket. While doing laundry, her mind jumped to the worst conclusion. So this is where the money is going, she shouted, waving the receipt in his face. When he walked in the door, Michael didn't bother denying it. I had dinner with a client. Not that it's any of your business, he said, brushing past her. Oh, it's my business. All right, Sarah retorted. While your children barely have food to eat, you are out spending money on God knows who. And then it began, the screaming, the accusations, and throwing of objects. David was in the room, with Grace, trying to distract her with a story, but the noise outside was impossible to ignore. Stay here, he told her. No, David, don't go, Grace whispered, clenching his hand. I will be right back, he promised. David stepped into the living room, just as his father raised a hand to strike his mother. Stop it, David screamed, his voice cracking. Michael, Paul, startled by his son's presence. Go to your room, David. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me." Daddy, David shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I'm tired of this. I'm tired of the yelling, the fighting, the breaking things. Can't you see you're halting, Grace? And me, can't you see that we are scared all the time?" For a moment's silence fell over the room. Michael and Sarah stared at their son, heel flickering briefly in their eyes. But the frail moment shattered as Sarah turned to Michael. "See what you've done? You have traumatized our children with your nonsense." Michael's SC. "I have traumatized them. You are the one who can stop shouting all the time." The fight resumed, and David realized his world would never reach them. His heart as he ran back to his room, tears streaming down his face. He held his sister Chloe, whispering to her, "It's going to be okay. I will protect you no matter what." That night the fight reached a breaking point. Sarah and Em's arguments peeled into the kitchen, where Michael grabbed a cup and threw it against the wall, and frustration scattered across the floor, glinting under the dim light. "Get out of my face, Sarah," he roared, shoving her outside. "Don't you dare touch me," Sarah screamed, grabbing a wooden spoon from the counter and brandishing it like a weapon. David stood at the door, frozen with fear. "Please stop," he cried again, his voice barely heard over the chaos. But no one listened. In the heat of the moment, Michael pushed her harder than he intended, and she stumbled backward. Her foot caught on a loose shard of glass, and she fell to the ground, eating her head on the edge of the counter. The room went silent. Sarah's voice was shaking as he stepped closer. Sarah didn't respond. Blood pooled beneath her head, spreading across the cold to floor. David screamed. He ran to his mother, shaking a limp body. "Mommy, mommy, wake up." But she didn't move. Michael knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to lift her. "Sarah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." His voice broke as tears streamed down his face. The neighbor, drawn by the commo, rushed in to see what had happened. Someone called an ambulance, but deep down David knew it was too late. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah's death was rude, an accident, but the damage was done. Michael, consumed by guilt and grief, withdrew completely. He stopped going to work, stopped eating, and stopped speaking. The vibrant man he once was had withered away into a whole shell. David and Grace was sent to live with Aunt Linda, who did her best to provide them with a stable home. But the scars of their past were not easily erased. One evening, as Linda talked Grace into bed, David sat by the window, staring at the darkened street. "David," Linda said softly, sitting beside him, "you have been so strong through all of this. But it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to miss your mom." David nodded, his eyes just with unshed tears. "I miss her every day," he whispered, "but I can't stop thinking if I had done more, maybe she would still be here, maybe Grace, and I would still have a family." Linda pulled him into a hug. "None of this was your fault, David. You did everything you could. You are just a child, and it was never your burden to bear." Months later, Michael's guilt overwhelmed him. One night, while David and Grace were asleep at Aunt Liz' house, Michael took his own life. He left a note apologizing to his children for the pain he had caused and asking for their forgiveness. When the news reached David, he felt a mixture of anger and sorrow. He couldn't understand why his father had abandoned them again, even after everything. But as it started by Grace's bedside that night, watching us sleep, he made a silent vow. "I will take care of you, Grace," he whispered. "I will make sure you have a life that is better far than all of this." Though the tragedy of their parents' death would always haunt them, David found strength in his love for his sister. The pain of the past never fully faded, but in the quiet moment when Grace's laughter filled the house, David found a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, love could still endure. Do you think David will be able to heal from the trauma and the mental stress his parent had put on him?